So in this picture, you see a classroom, but if you look closer, you notice that the classroom is full of children of the same race. In this case, all the children are white kids. A little bit of background on this is that in 1896 there was a court case called Plessy v. Ferguson. It was in the Supreme Court, and it ruled that separate but equal was legal. So in public places, they can have separate facilities for white people and people of color, mainly black people. If you see in this picture on the bottom right, there's a man drinking from a colored water fountain. He was not allowed to use the white water fountain because he was of color. On the left, there's a little cartoon about the Jim Crow era laws and how they differentiated people of color from using the same facilities in public as white people. So this was law until 1954, when Brown v. Board of Education was a Supreme Court case. Now, in Brown v. Board, they ruled that separate but equal was in fact illegal. As you see in the top left picture, it says the High Court banned segregation in public schools. So they ruled separate but equal is not legal in public facilities, which is why all public schools at that point had to be integrated. On the bottom right, you see the NAACP petitioning for an end to segregation. So if you look back, it was 1896 all the way to 1954. So several decades of segregation within the United States, in which colored people had to use separate public facilities than white people. So after Brown v. Board was passed, there were several decades of integration. These are pictures of a high school, and it's an integrated high school. As you can see, there are both white students and black students participating in the same activities, which would not have been allowed under Plessy v. Ferguson, but is of course allowed today because of Brown v. Board, which ruled that separate but equal is illegal. So this was the norm of integrating schools because, of course, it's the law. However, there's arisen a new trend, especially in North Carolina, that even though these schools are legally have to be integrated, there's a new trend of segregation due to racial, economic, and other demographic factors. So, but it's not under the law. Cannot figure out how to get my face out of here. Okay, I think my face is out of here now. So as I was saying, this trend of resegregation in North Carolina public high schools is what I'm going to be looking at, especially in Pitt County. So these are the 7 public high schools in Pitt County. A lot of times people forget about this early college high school, but it's still part of the public system. There are 7 Pitt County public high schools in which I will be examining the trend of resegregation, which brings me to my question: how is North Carolina's trend of regenerating trend of de facto racial segregation in high schools reflected in Pitt County public high schools? There are a few terms that I'm going to define. First is regenerating. So this is to bring into renewed existence or to grow again. So how is North Carolina's renewing trend something that's coming about again? The next is de facto. So there's a difference between de facto and de jure, which I was talking about a second ago. De facto means in fact or in effect, whether by law or by right or not, whereas de jure is according to a law or a right. So Plessy v. Ferguson ruled that de jure people of color had to attend separate schools, whereas now Brown v. Board, they attend the same schools. However, they are segregated de facto, which means they are not segregated by law. They are segregated by other factors like choice, class composition, whatnot. My last term is racial segregation. This is the purposeful separation of people on the premise of race. This is different than religious segregation. This is different than gender segregation. There have been instances of those. However, I'm going to be focusing on racial segregation at Pitt County public high schools. So once again, to look at my question, so how's North Carolina's the trend that's coming back of de facto racial segregation in schools reflected in those 7 Pitt County public high schools? One source that's incredibly helpful to me was by this guy named Charles Clotfelter. He's a professor at Duke, so he sees everything firsthand. It's close to home. He conducted a study called Who Teaches Whom, and it looks at the race and distribution of novice teachers. This was correlational research, in which he looked to discover whether teachers are put in classroom based on the race of students. He was looking at if teachers who had better degrees, more advanced degrees, are put into classrooms, better achieving classrooms based on race and whatnot. One quote is that, and I quote, differential exposure rates by race to inexperienced teachers cannot emerge unless students are segregated by race, which is actually very interesting. He points out that the only way for teachers to be put into higher performing classrooms with mainly white students, for example, is for those rooms to already be segregated, because if they weren't, then they couldn't put a better teacher. He found that more experienced teachers are in fact put into higher performing classrooms with mainly white people. So teachers with more advanced degrees are more likely to teach better performing students. Another source is by Stephanie Southworth. It's called Examining the Effects of School Composition on North Carolina Student Achievement Over Time. This is important to me because I'm looking at school composition, class composition, rather than school districting and whatnot, and how that would affect races. And that actually reminds me, one thing that I have to point out in my question is that in my research I'm going to be looking at the class composition of the 4 core classes needed to graduate. So that's science, English, social studies, and math. So for example, I'll look at the class composition of Standard English 3 versus Honors English 3 versus AP Lang, and see which races are put into those classes and the effects, or rather why they're put into those classes. So back to this source, her purpose was to discover a relationship between composition of race inside classrooms and how well the students achieve on tests. The method was meta-analysis research because she synthesized data to find a trend. So one quote is that students in racially imbalanced minority poverty schools have the lowest achievement, which is basically saying there is in fact a relationship between the composition of classes and the student achievement, which is ultimately what she found. This was in her conclusion. So it's pretty significant that just by putting a student in a certain classroom with other students who may or may not look like them, it can affect how they score on tests. And that actually reminds me of something interesting that's not necessarily related to this, but something that Mr. Mincher told me the other day is that students who, if before they take a test, have to designate what race they are, could do better or worse on that test. So for example, if a black student is taking the SAT and asks them to designate their race, and they say black, then they ultimately will end up doing worse based on research on that test, because they psychologically they feel the odds are stacked against them, even if they don't ultimately think that. It's in their head somewhere. So if they designate what race they are, then they'll end up doing worse on that test. And that doesn't necessarily have to do with this research, but it's something that I found interesting. So some of my primary sources, I'll have 2 main primary sources, one of which I will rely heavily on. I have not gotten it yet, but I have been granted access. So I've not actually viewed the documents, but I know I can. It's the Pitt County Schools data on those public high schools and the races of the students in those classrooms. It'll be completely confidential and anonymous, so there's no concern about that stuff. But I will not be able to see names, but I will be able to see what races are in, Standard English 3, Honors English 3, AP Language. That's going to be my main primary source, and I will analyze the races in those classrooms. And another main primary source is going to be surveys. I'm going to survey the students. So the first primary source is going to give me what is happening in those classrooms, whereas the second source is going to tell me why. Why is that happening? It'll be surveys from the students, from the teachers, maybe some personal interviews. And it'll be questions such as, do you think that you are in the right classroom? Something along the lines of that. Like, do students think they could have done better in honors if they're in standard? Or do they feel like they're in AP, but they're about to fail out and they should have been put in honors? So I will rely most heavily on the data from Pitt County Schools, but I will also look at those surveys. Now lastly, my method, I'm going to do a little bit of correlational research and a little bit of historical research. The correlational research will not go into the type of depth that you see in master's studies. I'm not going to find statistical numbers and those correlation coefficients and whatnot, because I'm not good at stats. But I will find the correlation, and I'll find some numbers, and I'm going to look at historical research to see how that trend fits into North Carolina's greater trend. So it's all about looking at those 7 Pitt County Public High Schools, the core classes, finding the trend in those classes, and then relating it back to the greater trend that's already been discovered in North Carolina. And that will be my research.